Hello, this is Richard Pawson. It's 12:43 p.m., August 20th, Tuesday. This is the climate portion of the report. We normally update this about once a month. We're looking at the U.S. Drought Monitor, which you can find at droughtmonitor.unl.edu, and you can probably do some searches. It probably comes up under USDA and a few other government sites. At any rate, this is a drought monitor map I have of August 13th. It's updated every Thursday. We can see the East Coast recovered from last year's drought. And for a while, even most of the Corn Belt, even into some of the plains, had recovered. Since then, however, we can see that the drought has migrated west on into Illinois, Iowa. Now this is just mild, light drought to just plain dry, okay, abnormally dry. But see how it's moved on up in towards Michigan, Wisconsin. It's moved on up into the Minnesota, up in the northern plains. It's grown a little more intense here in the southwest drought, and it's moved on up in towards, heading towards the northeast, and is finally touching the Canadian border. Ultimately, most of the Corn Belt has probably seen fairly decent weather, but not fantastic weather. And as I warned early this year, I just felt like some of the larger super cycles, even though they probably reversed last year, struck like a bolt of lightning last year for the 27-year cycle drought, impacted crop and production numbers on a 27-year cycle, that I warned you that this year the cycle could be turning back towards better conditions, but it wouldn't fully recover, it wouldn't be that great, and there could be other types of problems, basically just lingering momentum of problems. And we've seen that. It was too cold and wet, at least for the Corn Belt earlier this year. It did some permanent damage, granted maybe less, maybe it recovered in some areas, but not fully recovered. And then I also warned that there was a good chance in August, or I warned that we could see a hot, dry summer, but as time went on, it was obvious that wasn't going to take place. But I warned there could still be other kinds of problems in August, and we have a mixture of problems. Some places too cold, some places too hot, some places too wet, some places too dry. And now we're seeing dryness for the western Corn Belt, and then it can be too cold at times and too warm at times. So we're starting to see an impact at least on soybeans, maybe a little additional impact on corn. So the bottom line is the country is still classified as being a mess, in my opinion, as far as weather. Certainly crops are going to recover quite a bit from last year, but they're not going to fully recover. We're not going to get the grand, great crops that a lot of people thought. Now, I've seen some other problems relating to these cycles that go around the world. In other words, I've studied many countries years ago and found they operate off the same cycles, and many of those countries will have the cycles timed about the same time, either the same year or maybe about a 1 or 2 year difference. We've seen problems in China in the southeast, or south to east China, hot and dry now, but earlier they had problems of being too wet in some other regions and it hurt 10% of their wheat crop. We've seen problems in Brazil with frost hurting maybe 30% of the crop, although I don't know, I haven't seen any updates on that. India was too wet, too late for a while, had some crop problems. And there's been others around the world, but there's been some fine crops in other areas, such as Ukraine. Had another terrible winter and it hurt wheat and this and that. And now today they tell us, oh, it's actually having a fine corn crop, at least, if not wheat crop. Russia may have been too hot and dry lately and may have a little bit of wheat problems, but basically the world appears to be producing enough wheat. Okay, now we're going to go to some raw data for the climate and look at more long term. And this is a U.S. summer temperature, just the summer months, and they're basically June, July, August, okay? And we then record that, and we then look for cycles. And we'd come to the conclusion we were supposed to have a warm-up during the 2000s, but it could peak late 2000s to early 2010s for a 9-year cycle that could possibly trigger a 27-year cycle. And I'm a little suspicious we've seen that. I think that's why we've seen cooler temps this year compared to last year, even though we've had some record heat in some areas of the country. It looks like to me the summer is starting to cool off a bit. I think the annual numbers are going to start, temperature degrees are going to start to cool off a bit. And we're due for a 9-year cycle downtrend later this decade. And Raymond Wheeler, a famous cyclical research climatologist who basically said that climate seems to correlate, at least coincidentally or perhaps fundamentally, to how we operate our lives, the affairs of man, do business. It relates to stock market, real estate, as well as, of course, animal life and population life in general on Earth. So he really put climate as a very important item, and he did some very good forecasts. Somebody wrote a book in the 1980s and stated that from 1950s to early 1980s, he was basically correct 65 to 85% of the time. And at any rate, he made a forecast around 2015 we'd see a cooling period. 2000 we'd see a global warming period, and then maybe even as early as 1980, and he even related those to political change and business change. And you can see now he was correct. 1980, 2000, monumental years, or 1980s and 2000s. Okay, so global warming is for real. It's going to last to the 2030s, 2040s. It'll top out for cycles at least up to 1,000 years, if not up to 100,000 years. But the point is, and that's my research, but I find it dovetails with Raymond Wheeler's research. But the point is, it's time for at least a 9-year cycle setback here, that it can get cooler later this decade. And that should help create better crops. But the problem is you don't know how volatile and crazy it'll be, just like it was this year. It could still even hurt crops. And there's this theory that the last 20 or 30 years, it was too easy to grow crops. The next 20 or 30 years will be hard to grow crops. And it rotates. It's a cycle of every 20 or 30 years from easy to difficult. Okay, once this cooling phase is over, we're just going to warm up again in the 2020s and then maybe continue in the 2030s, or you'll see a cooling phase and then again. And another problem we have is because we're coming close to these super cycles, major super cycles coming to the 2030s, you may see a speeding up characteristic of global warming such that it can counter these normal cyclical cooling trends, so they can't cool as well. So this may not work out quite as well on the cooling side, but we anticipate a little bit of cooling. At any rate, we did see the spike up of temperatures, and we did get crop problems, and we had forecasts at the same time that we would see lower precipitation. And what we have here is, this is the raw precipitation data for summer months, the summer season, and we were looking for a top around here for a 9-year cycle, and it should go on down into a 9-year cycle bottom and for a 27-year cycle bottom. And I thought, well, gee, if we're coming into a 27-year cycle bottom for precipitation, which means low precipitation and abnormally low, and if we're going to do the same for temperature but hot temperature, that sounds like high risk of a hot drought. And we got it, 2012. Now, I'd been looking for it back in the mid-2000s to late 2000s because I thought it would coincide with the price bull market for grains like corn and going to a new record high price. It didn't align that way correctly. Apparently, price and economy is a little bit out of sync with the climate, or the climate's out of sync. They're doing a little bit different things. And it turned out the better time for this calamity was 2008 to 2014. 2010, we got a clue. And we were on our way. 2011, we got even more damage, even more on our way. And 2012, it was the coup de grace, the lightning bolt, the big slam, and we got the hot, dry drought. Now, we still have 2013 and 2014 eligible years for disasters and maybe even something worse, but my guess is it's going to be less so, and we will see some improvement. And then after 2014 on into 2017, we should see some more significant improvement. But ultimately, later this decade, I think we got another disaster coming. At any rate, you can see that we've got this pull down for precipitation for 27-year cycle, and we should see a rebound later this decade, which means we're going to come into a normal to cool temperature time with normal to even wet time. That should translate to some improving of crops someday, but it also can overreact itself such that it can even damage crops from too cool, too wet. Interesting enough. And all of that still fits in a global warming trend, believe it or not. So at any rate, yes, it doesn't surprise me we've seen some improvement this year for the crops, but also doesn't surprise me we saw some disasters around the world and here in the U.S., and we're going to continue to see a greater number of disasters and volatile climate for the next 20 or 30 years compared to the last 20 or 30 years, which is why it should make it difficult for crops and life in general. And we're going to see that the global warming trend is still intact. It's still going to get warmer into the 2030s. Now, global warming is primarily cyclical, so it's caused by nature, not man. But I do think man has an increasing impact. So I'm not entirely in the pro-global warming camp. especially if they're stating it's man's problem. Well, it is man's problem. We have to deal with it, but we're not necessarily creating the entire situation. I think you go back 100 years, we were only creating 10% of the problem. Now maybe we're creating 90% of the problem, but the point is most of the damage is already there, and it's done by nature. It's nature's cycle, and so I'm more inclined of how do we deal and work with it and live with it. But I think it's fascinating if we could learn how to actually control it. And so I'm in that pro-global warming camp. What can we learn and do about it? But I just have to say, it's not entirely man's fault here. This is the nature of things. At any rate, that's our climate forecast. I think we'll probably coast throughout this year without too many more problems. I think we could have an early frost here. And I just want to warn you, we can get back to some normal temps and maybe some cooler temps, but it could become quite volatile and be too cool. And you never know when you're going to get that shocking, hot, dry, drought summer any year for the rest of this decade anyways, just because of that underlying global warming trend. And again, by the 2020s, that global warming trend should be right back at full impact here. We will get warmer. So that's been our forecast. I think it's worked fairly well this year, and we'll continue to update you as we learn more. Thank you.